Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Archive of Empire, Knowledge, Conquest, and the Making of the Early Modern British World, by Asheesh Kapur Siddique. Narrated by Keval Shah. Introduction. The proliferation of data and its collection, ordering, and use by modern states and companies are among the most striking features of global society today. Empowered by satellites, computers, transmission control protocol, internet protocol, TCP/IP, mobile communications, global navigation systems, and artificial intelligence, governments and corporations face the challenge of compiling, analyzing, and brokering information about human behavior that is being produced, circulated, and stored at an unprecedented and continuously accelerating scale and speed. Both public and private actors marshal this information to shape and execute projects of resource extraction, rule, and profit-making in relation to what are increasingly multi-ethnic, multilingual, and multi-confessional constituencies whom they seek to bind together through the artifice of commitments to shared political or consumerist norms. The modern technological infrastructure of data management is dazzling, disquieting, and seemingly unprecedented because of both the scale of collecting this infrastructure enables and its facility for storage, search, and retrieval. But the problem of using information to govern in relation to human difference has far deeper roots. The reason lies in the persistence of empires across the globe for roughly the last 4.5 millennia. Polities that attempt to incorporate, through conquest, trade, and settlement, multiple peoples with heterogeneous cultural backgrounds under the authority of a sovereign, and face the attendant challenge of collecting, ordering, and deploying information about culturally different peoples to produce political order. Perhaps no single political formation since the fall of Rome faced the problem of governing in relation to cultural difference more acutely than the British Empire. In the period spanning the 16th to the early 20th centuries, Great Britain, an island polity roughly the size of the modern U.S. state of Oregon, laid claim to what became an empire that at its height spanned a quarter of the globe and encompassed millions of people of linguistic, ethnic, and religious backgrounds with nothing in common with either their rulers or each other, except the shared circumstances of imperial rule. How did the British Empire gather, organize, and deploy information in relation to governing difference? Scholarship on empire and information, spurred especially by a series of lectures given by Harold A. Innis at the University of Oxford and published in 1950 as Empire and Communications, has focused almost exclusively on the modern period, when technologies like steam, telegraph, mass print, radio, and television defined the limits and possibilities of imperial communication. But we know far less about how forms of media shaped imperial rule in an earlier period when none of those technologies existed. Given that one of Innis's major themes was the transformational impact of parchment and paper on government, this lacuna is paradoxical, for it was precisely those technologies that decisively shaped the information order of early modern Europe and its empires. This book provides an answer through an examination of how the early modern British Empire aspired to make power coherent through writing. It argues that between the early 17th century and the early 19th century, governing institutions attempted to rule what came to be an empire spanning two oceanic spheres by transposing a technique of making knowledge central to early modern statecraft into the project of constructing overseas institutional formations. Correlating incoming information about the conduct of subjects and aliens in physically distant spaces with a set of normative conceptions of good governance derived from accounts of how humans have behaved in the past. I trace how officials sought to produce political order through the development of sovereign reason, expressed in writing, and show how the empire's demographic transformation complicated that work. Expansion raised the question in the minds of administrators as to whether written records contained the knowledge requisite to govern the non-English-speaking populations, who inhabited the lands over which the British asserted sovereignty. This book explores the conflicting ways administrators answered that question, and the shared mode of archival reasoning in which contestation occurred. The Archive of Empire begins by tracing how practices of creating, circulating, and preserving sovereign writing characteristic of early modern statecraft came to be applied from the 17th century onward to English administration in North America, the Caribbean, and South Asia. Archives of documents generated by officials in the conduct of administration functioned as sites for generating knowledge, facilitating the maintenance and justification of rule. Both royal and corporate administrators relied on archives, created through the dispatch of documents to and from colonial agents, as sources of authority and information from which they could develop policies addressing present-day concerns of government based on the examples of past precedents. They learned this technique of administration by archive from the information order that came to characterize the statecraft of late Elizabethan England. That period saw the development of two phenomena, whose extension into imperial politics in the 17th and 18th centuries this book examines. The first phenomenon was the development of an information state, in which councillors attempted to produce and control knowledge about political affairs by analysing the contents of contemporary correspondence in relation to authoritative bodies of textual evidence in their possession, circulating written documents between the metropole and officials abroad. Administrators sought to both direct the conduct of officers and collect geographic, demographic, diplomatic, and economic information. London administrators analysed the contents of these documents to ensure that the manifestation of imperial sovereignty on the ground remained consonant with metropolitan expectations. Officials then filed the records within developing organizational systems as they sought to form a body of precedential knowledge under their control that could guide the work of decision-making in the present and future. They read this information in a manner that sought to confirm their pre-existing conceptions of how empire was supposed to work, not because they were open to the possibility of changing their ideas. The second phenomenon reflected the failure of officials' aspirations to control the possession and dissemination of this knowledge, the rise of a political public sphere through which the secrets of state and corporation were regularly appropriated in political discourse by their critics and opponents via the constant leakage of records beyond the official channels to which their creators intended them to be confined. The experiences of many of the actors who were victimized by imperial rule, including enslaved Africans and their descendants, and Native Americans, had no significant presence within this system. Several generations of decolonizing scholarship on the archive have painstakingly demonstrated that the voices of the colonized can be heard only with difficulty or inaccurately from imperial administrative records, and have pioneered methods of reading such texts with the goal of recovering subaltern experience, while also emphasizing that the violent processes of empire building make these experiences in many ways unknowable. Although mine is a different project, I take seriously the argument that it is impossible to turn to readings against the grain without a prior sense of colonial archives, texture, and granularity. To that end, this book explains how conditions of alterity emerged in the first place and traces their material consequences in structures of imperial knowledge. Crucially, non-Europeans in the British Atlantic were thought about very differently than non-Europeans in British Asia. From the perspective of an imperial governing and commercial elite who understood Native Americans as outside the compass of the political subject, and were committed to the ideological fiction that enslaved Africans were property, not people, neither fit within the archival regime of governance. Their exploitation never prompted reference to records in order to be justified. In the vastly different context of imperial South Asia, however, officials sought to apply the archival epistemology to govern Indians. There, they endeavoured to rule not simply on the basis of records from English sovereigns, but also from a variety of grants and delegations of power from Mughal government that resulted in the corporation's literal inhabitation of Mughal offices under the ultimate authority of the Mughal emperor. Imperial administrators in India came to see the exercise of Mughal offices as incumbent on the acquisition and deployment of a different set of archives than those available in the metropole. Following the emergence by the 1690s of an administrative infrastructure governing an extended polity that contemporaries increasingly understood as an empire, official archival systems came to be profoundly enmeshed in the political contestation and struggles over how that empire should be ruled. Like their Elizabethan and Stuart predecessors, the officials who created imperial archives aspired to control the circulation and use of information by designing these systems to be closed, self-referential, and secret. But, like their predecessors, they failed, just as the materials ostensibly under the privileged control of the English state in the late 15th and 16th centuries came to be regularly appropriated by its agents, opponents, and actors interested in making claims on government rooted in the authoritative act of referencing records. So too did the documents of imperial government flow beyond the control of official institutions. Competing interest groups sought to mobilize both the rhetoric of documents and the actual material contents of archives in order to construe policy proposals related to imperial governance as authoritative. In these contentious debates, records were used for a variety of purposes. One political practice saw records invoked post facto as justification for decisions and actions. Another practice involved studying records for their propositional content, which then might inform the reader's future behavior. Other actors might not read records at all, but instead simply refer to them in political debate, print them as proof of a policy position, or display them as a material manifestation of authority. Underlying these and other modes of using records was a widely shared understanding that a statement of fact about matters of government could not stand apart from its referentiality to a physical document that either actually existed or that people might plausibly be led to believe existed. The proliferation of these practices, moreover, reflected that these protocols and techniques of document use collectively constituted a powerful style of political reasoning, a way of making a claim in which the presentation of the claim's evidentiary basis was considered as integral to its persuasive effect as its discursive enunciation. War and conquest drove administrators to deploy the political practices of archival governance, to conceptualize ways of ruling an empire that contemplated the membership of non-British subjects. Administrators sought to posit the existence of non-English and non-Latin language archives created out of the materials of conquered peoples. They analogized these archives as equivalent to the metropolitan collections in their capacity to produce authoritative political knowledge. In the Atlantic world, the practice of analogy bolstered metropolitan power. At the same time, in the course of the crisis of imperial authority in British North America during the 1760s and 1770s, the idea that archival documents might legitimate a state's policies came to be critiqued by rebels, and a different idea of the relationship between writing and sovereignty advanced in its place within the political discourse of the American Revolution. With respect to South Asia, officials on the ground sought to posit the existence of a non-English language archive that they believed was better suited than metropolitan records to govern Indians. By the early 19th century, the terms of political discourse had come to change in a manner that began to push the archive out of the field of contestation. New forms of knowledge ascended in the estimation of administrators as best suited to solving problems of government, and the consequence was the transformation of archives from tools of rule into sites of history. Central to this transformation was the rise of a set of entwined ideas around the nature of government and information. First, a concept of officials as accountable not only to sovereigns, but also to a public, and second, the idea that this public needed access to information in order to render officials accountable. As the sixth and final chapter of the book shows, the archive would play a different role in this shifting constellation of power, one that signaled the recession, both temporally and ideologically, of an early modern concept of sovereignty and its particular braiding of power and information. This development was seen in the diminishing administrative power of archivists, a broadening of access to archives, and an ideology of political knowledge that disconnected policy from the materiality of information. The language of early modern statecraft. Bureaucracy, defined as a system of executing rule predicated on a separation between politics and administration, is the organizing category through which the world excavated in this book has been conceptualized. But, applied to any political formation before the mid-18th century, the term bureaucracy misleads. Unlike the state, bureaucracy formed no part of the conceptual vocabulary of early modern government, and the people involved in running states, churches, and corporations never referred to themselves using its cognate bureaucrats. Instead, the word was first invoked by critics of the early modern European state, initially in France during the 1760s, to refer at once to the meddling of government in things with which it should not concern itself, as well as to servants of government who were not appointed to benefit the public interest. In the aftermath of the French Revolution, the word became an epithet that Napoleon's opponents hurled against the multiplicity of employments under his rule, which they believed embodied an invisible and mischievous power that usurped the natural and civil rights of the people. Indeed, only in the Napoleonic period did the word bureaucracy come to be widely used in the English language. Inherent in the concept was the idea of state servants thwarting something that only ascended to normative status in political discourse in the late 18th century. natural and civil rights, while at the same time evading the form of public accountability the bearers of those rights demanded. As such, the birth of bureaucracy was conjoined to the emergence of the ideology that its formulators sought to make into a reality: popular sovereignty. But until the crises of legitimacy that befell European monarchies during the Age of Revolutions, and despite the rise of rights talk in the 17th century, the exercise of political power in Europe and its empires was widely understood to inhere not in the consent of the people to their rulers, but instead the possession of privileges conferred by sovereigns and monopolized by an elite. Applied to the early modern period, therefore, bureaucracy imports an anachronistic vision of early modern states and companies as primarily concerned with responsiveness to democratic demands, when they were not. Before the old regime became ancien, it was simply the regime. To understand how early modern government worked requires attending to its practices, not simply their critics. Rather than bureaucrats, those who ran early modern governments understood themselves to be officials, holders of office, a word derived from the Latin officium, and which by the 16th century had become a fundamental term of European discourse on government. By occupying an office within the body of a sovereign organization, whether monarchy, church, guild, or corporation, an official took responsibility for the performance of a set of associated duties, understood to be essential to keeping a part of the overall system functioning. Office was thus primarily understood as a position one held, and only secondarily as a physical location one occupied. The identity of these officials lay in their manifestation of the specific forms of conduct and reasoning defined by the head of the body, as requisite to the performance of these duties. The heads of these sovereign bodies detailed and delineated the precise definitions of these forms of conduct, reasoning, and duties, which occupants of office were expected to execute. The stimulation for early modern thinking about the nature of office and government came not from reading Max Weber, but rather from Cicero, whose De Officiis, written in 44 BCE, was well regarded in early modern Western Europe as the best of books for the study and exercise of virtue, a manual of precepts that instructed readers in the government of ourselves, in all the offices, actions, and conditions of human life, including that lived in the service of sovereigns, as one of the work's English translators noted in 1680. From Cicero, as one 18th-century writer put it, divines have borrowed their systems, legislators their constitutions, statesmen their maxims, and magistrates their practice. Cicero provided a vocabulary for thinking about official conduct, and a guide for acting in office, such that, by turning to his work, in whatever state of life a man is in, whether public or private, of governor or governed, an early modern administrator expected he would find rules how he ought to demean himself in any of those capacities. In contexts characterized by relative spatial proximity between rulers and ruled, the communication of these rules could occur through the physical and spoken performance of relationships of deference and authority, through courtly rituals before the observant eyes of the powerful. But as states extended the geographic range of their claims to dominion over land and water, distance prompted rulers to supplement the verbal and gestural communication of their command with inanimate objects, that they invested with the ability to bear their power into spaces where their physical bodies could not so easily be present. From perhaps the 2nd century BCE until about the 14th century CE, the dominant substrate on which such communication took place was parchment, made from animal hide. Paper, initially invented in China and made out of plants, introduced into the Arab world in the 8th century via long-distance trade, and transformed under the Abbasids into a substance produced out of linen rags, joined parchment as the medium of European textual cultures, from its introduction by Muslims into the Iberian Peninsula in the 11th century. Comparatively easier to produce than parchment, as well as harder to fabricate because it is more susceptible to tearing, paper by the beginning of the 16th century overtook the animal-based substrate as the quotidian technology through which European commercial exchange, ecclesiastical governance, secular administration, and scholarly cogitation came to be conducted. Parchment continued to be used as a prestige material on which information deemed especially important, such as grants of royalty or church privilege, was recorded and preserved. Commercial and territorial expansion placed these officials and their substrates in contact with cultures of governance that operated on procedural and material protocols which were profoundly different, not only from those of Europeans, but also from one another. In South Asia, for example, parchment was incomprehensible as a substrate for many regimes, since its production involved the slaughter of animals considered divine by demographically numerous and politically powerful communities, such as Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains. Rather, South Asian polities used a variety of materials, including the copper plates employed early in the Common Era by ruling dynasties, such as the Mauryas, palm leaves within Hindu court culture, and birch bark and cloth in the Buddhist monastic communities of Kashmir, to inscribe, circulate, and store knowledge. These forms of documentation persisted and coexisted alongside the paper-based modes of record-keeping that entered South Asia from the 13th century, via the conduit of Islam. The first peoples of the Americas presented an equally distinctive approach from the parchment paper world of Europe and the substrates of South Asian governments. While the myth that Native Americans transmitted knowledge orally, not through writing, may persist as a schoolroom commonplace, it is empirically untenable in light of decades of research exploring the communication practices, including signs, wampum, shell beads strung together, and pictographs in which people circulated and preserved information about trade, war, and justice. Applied to many of the societies in the Americas, the characterization is also clearly erroneous, as it cannot account for phenomena such as the pictographic inscriptions on animal skins, rocks, and beads of societies of the Great Plains, or the bark codices of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican civilizations. As Europeans brought their parchment paper culture of government to Atlantic and Indian oceanic geographies through war, conquest, migration, and trade, they mobilized these substrates as instruments of communication among a variety of powerful interests, including their officers, whom they invested with the authority to execute command at a distance, the native peoples, into whose homelands they violently encroached, and with whom they fought, exchanged, enslaved, and at times cohabitated, and their subjects, over whom they sought to assert power at vast spatial remove. It has become common to characterize the process of expansion undertaken by the English crown and companies in both the Asian and Atlantic hemispheres as one of negotiation.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?